Today is the day we celebrate the birthday of our first president, George Washington, as part of a holiday that has somehow, though it's not quite clear how, been expanded to celebrate all of our nation's presidents. We've had 43 of them so far. A lot of people think it's actually 44, but Grover Cleveland served 2 non-consecutive terms, so he usually gets counted twice. Any presidential historian will tell you that a lot of these presidents have been pretty bad. In fact, some have been downright terrible. And the list of terrible presidents is actually a lot longer than the list of great ones. So instead of celebrating our best presidents this year, our Lincolns and our FDRs, we here at All In decided to truly grapple with the American presidency by looking at our worst presidents. I'm not talking about the William Henry Harrison types who just didn't accomplish anything. Though to be fair, Harrison didn't have much of a chance. He died of pneumonia a month after taking office. No, we want to gaze into the heart of darkness. The presidents whose corruption, malfeasance, incompetence, cluelessness, racism, violence, and ethnic cleansing made the country and the world worse. Historians actually spend a lot of time thinking about how our presidents compare to each other. Opinions do tend to change over the years. In 1962, not long after he left office, a panel of historians rated Dwight Eisenhower as a mediocre to below average president. By 2012, a Newsweek survey of historians put him in the top 10. There's some real consistency at the bottom of the list, however. Andrew Johnson, James Buchanan, and Warren Harding, consistently rated by presidential scholars as the 3 worst presidents in American history in surveys taken by Siena College between 1982 and 2010. Ulysses S. Grant and Franklin Pierce tended to round out the bottom 5. But in 2010, the last time the survey was taken, a new face popped up on the all-time worst list, George W. Bush, who came in at 5th worst president in American history. According to Siena, Bush rated especially poorly among historians in handling the economy, communication, ability to compromise, foreign policy accomplishments, and intelligence. Today, I've invited 3 guests to make their individual pitches for worst president ever. I've got my own nominee, which I will share in a moment. So joining me now, Doreen Warren, Associate Professor of Political Science, International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, John Nichols, my colleague at The Nation, where he's Washington correspondent, and Jim Moore, communications expert at Big Ben Strategies, co-author of Bush's Brain, How Karl Rove Made George W. Bush Presidential. All right, John, I will begin with you. Your nominee for worst president ever.
It's got to be Andrew Johnson. I'm not willing to give an inch on this one. And look, I advocated for some pretty tough action against George W. Bush, and I certainly have no taste for Herbert Hoover and some of these other folks. But Andrew Johnson, who became president of the United States because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, opposed the Freedmen's Bureau, which was going to allow African Americans to begin to have some sort of economic stake in the country where they had just been released from slavery. He blocked the Civil Rights Act, which was to allow African Americans basic citizenship rights. He fought against the 14th Amendment, which brought African Americans into full citizenship. And he actually vetoed allowing states to enter the United States because they might have tipped the balance in favor of civil rights.
Yeah,
He also implemented Reconstruction in a disaster.
Yeah, we should give the context here is that Johnson's basically a stone-cold white supremacist racist. And I'm not saying that as like a hyperbole. I mean, here's Andrew Johnson. This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men, opposed to full citizenship and liberation for the African Americans newly freed, put onto the ticket basically just so that there would be a border state Democrat who could hold the government together, and then suddenly finds himself president after Lincoln's assassinated. And, you know, there's a case to be made, John, that if you had someone there, if you had Lincoln, Reconstruction could have looked a lot different, such that the entire civil rights era of the 1960s would have happened then.
Well, understand this. Reconstruction was supposed to be a project that allowed Southerners who had supported slavery ultimately to come back into the process to bring African Americans in. It was a complex process. You needed a very sophisticated but very strong leadership. In this case, Andrew Johnson refused to work with Congress. He implemented something he called presidential reconstruction, and he allowed the southern states to develop their own constitutions, many of which had specific rules to disenfranchise African Americans. And the last point I'll make is, when I covered the Florida recount of 2000, if you traced back some of the legal structures that made it possible to upset the real count in that state and it clear the way for George Bush to become president, you will find that they can be traced back to actions taken in the late 1860s because Andrew Johnson let it happen.
So Andrew Johnson, the tragedy of Reconstruction, the unfulfilled promise, basically a white supremacist, racist who comes in and destroys a possibility in that crucial moment for something like equality, full citizenship in that moment. Doreen Warren, you've got another nominee. Who's your nominee?
Well, you know, Johnson he's close, but for me, I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, so I have to go at number 31, Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover. Put him on the board, Herbert
Hoover. Who
you're on notice.
Was on watch at the midst of the worst economic crisis in American history, the Great Depression. He presided as Secretary of Commerce and then as president over the so-called Roaring Twenties, the highest levels of inequality that we've experienced as a country until very recently, a decade of wage stagnation, workers couldn't afford to buy products.
It all sounds very familiar.
It all sounds very familiar. What was his solution to the Great Depression? Well, the first thing he says, 1928, as he's running for re-election, or for his first election, he says, we're nearer today to the ideal of the abolition of poverty and fear from the lives of men and women than ever before in any land.
I think everyone look at this quote for a second, because this is the guy on the eve of the worst economic crisis the country will face, basically being like, it's just around the corner.
That's right.
Everything's working great. We're driving right in the right direction.
And even the Republican campaign slogan for him in 1928 was, to put a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. That was the slogan. Black Thursday hits. He actually says, and this is reminiscent of John McCain during our own Great Recession and crisis. He says, after Black Thursday, the fundamental business of the country, that is production and distribution, is on a sound and prosperous basis.
Yeah.
So he still didn't get it. Now, what were his solutions to people homeless, starving, unemployed? Private charity. Yeah. Not any government intervention. Sounds very similar to Paul Ryan.
And so
others.
you have massive unrest. You have unbelievable amounts of misery. The government doesn't do nearly what it needs to do to pull the country out of the Great Depression.
He's still in the ideology of laissez-faire economics, that there should be no government intervention into the economy. He refuses to do any deficit spending. He was all about balanced budget.
Balancing the budget in the midst of basically mass destruction across the country.
He takes office at 3% unemployment. By the time he leaves, it's around 23%.
Yeah, it's hard to beat that record for economic mismanagement.
And by the way, one last political point, he ushered in the dominance of the Democratic Party in 1932, both in terms of the White House with FDR winning, as well as Congress.
It's a total blowout in 32. All right, so we've got Hoover on the board, we've got Johnson on the board, one for Reconstruction and his role in that, another for probably the worst economic mismanagement. There's someone else more recent. Who, Jim, I think you want to enter into the conversation. I've got my own president with the initials AJ. We're going to give you both of those right after this break. Stick around. We're back duking it out over the worst president ever, a crowded field. I'm here with Doreen Warren, John Nichols, and Jim Moore. And Jim, you've got a nominee. It's a guy you wrote a book about. Who do you think's the worst president ever?
Actually, whoever becomes president, Chris, thinking they're going to end up behind Millard Fillmore. But I come into this with the perspective of a former long-haired hippie Vietnam-era war protester, and I think what matters the most to our country is when a president comes in and executes geopolitics that have this sort of global impact but also ruin things for all of us at home. And I think what happened under George W. Bush is that they cooked intelligence, they created a case for a war to invade Iraq, to get even for his dad, and as the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said, we had no choice. The country floated on a sea of oil. The idea was to get oil, to avenge his dad, and hopefully end sectarian violence. And we look at this years later, and we have hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Some human rights groups put it at million plus that are dead. Tens of thousands of American veterans who are harmed and whose lives have been ruined or they have been killed. And then we end up with a Veterans Administration that can't handle all of this. On top of that, as he's launching these two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, he's administering a huge tax cut. At a time when the spending is about to go up, he gives a tax cut to the upper income, to corporations, and then all of this comes home to roost in our economy. We get a big deficit. Our country is now still struggling from all of that. So my belief is that regardless of any category you might consider, I think the judges have to give the Oscar for worst president to George W.
Yeah, I mean, you make a very strong case, and I think one of the things that's key to point out about W is, unlike, say, Lyndon Johnson, who has this real kind of divided, split record in terms of what he did internationally, the Vietnam War, and what he did domestically, which is pushed through and signed some of the most significant landmark legislation in American history. George W. Bush's non-war record at home, I mean, Medicare Part D, which is sort of works and is extremely expensive, and then also overseeing the worst financial crisis, since the Great Depression.
Right.
I think that absolutely puts him in the running. I would say from just a pure, if you want to talk about like who was the most amoral sociopath we ever had as president of the United States, you got to go with Andrew Jackson. It basically was like the country elected Tony Soprano, all right, to be president. The guy, and this guy personally killed many people, not like ordered people in the war, like in duels, killed lots of people. We still don't know how many. As a soldier, ordered his men to raid and kill women and children when he was raiding Indian camps. He pushed through the Indian Removal Act, which was an official state push of ethnic cleansing that led to the Trail of Tears. He overrode the Supreme Court. Tens of thousands of Indians removed from the South forcibly in what was one of the most shameful moments in all of American history. And I want to say this about Andrew Jackson. This is the guy who at the end of his life says this: he had but two regrets. He had been unable to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun. By the way, I don't like John C. Calhoun, sort of share his feelings, nonviolent myself. That said, the thing to think about this guy is that he was one of the most, like, the idea that this person ran the American state, this incredibly violent man who in his personal life, in what he did in office, was just this omnidirectional maelstrom of violence against people, that he was just racking up kills. I mean, this is Andrew Jackson. This was
I'm sold.
Yes. Well, the other thing I will say is that he also got rid of the National Bank, which led to massive amounts of crisis. The big question I think on the table, and Dorian, I'll put it to you, is it true? I mean, how do you make the case for Hoover when you look at these two areas of like economic management and the misery it causes, and then the sheer power and force of violence that a president commands and the hell that they can unleash in their seat as commander-in-chief?
Chris, that's an impossible question, and you have me almost equivocating, but I'm going to give it one more try.
Yeah.
Hoover, when he left office, was responsible for the passage of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. Why? People were suffering so much, we had to shorten the time between the election and inauguration. Elections in November, inauguration used to be in March. Hoover was so awful, people were suffering so much that we amended the Constitution to make inauguration January 20th because of Hoover.
He was that bad. We amended the Community Constitution to get it out. I do think that you should all, if you get a chance tonight, root around Wikipedia, read some of the stuff about Andrew Johnson, read Eric Foner's Fine History of Reconstruction, which is not kind to Andrew Johnson, relive the Bush period in the many fine books that were produced, or, go to the MSNBC archives if you can pull up the much fine programming here, and read some Andrew Jackson stuff, too. Really quite a character. Dorian Warren from Columbia University, John Nichols from The Nation, Jim Moore from Big Ben Strategies. Gentlemen, thank you all.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
All right, now that you've told you our picks for the All-In Hall of Bad Presidents, which one would you pick? Go to our website, msnbc.com/all-in to vote. That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening.